So good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. Having been in Nebraska for, I think, about 36 hours, I realized I needed a Nebraska story, and I was really scratching my head. What am I going to do? And I was delighted. I walked in, and Deborah Lee is sitting here, and it's probably one of the very few Nebraskans I knew before coming to Nebraska. I know a lot of fake Nebraskans, like Peter and people who have been transplanted here. But I met Deborah about, I guess, maybe 10 years ago, and when we were doing the circuits of the World Water Council and the International Council of the American Water Works Association. But Deborah's sitting here with this red sign saying 5 minutes and 3 minutes and 1 minute. So now Deborah's there keeping me well in line. But it's really wonderful to be here in Nebraska. I also really want to thank our partners across the University of Nebraska system, and Peter and the Water for Food Global Institute, but also the collaborators that we work with in the university. And interestingly enough, we've been working a lot on droughts with the University of Nebraska with our colleagues in Brazil, and we'll now be bringing that experience to Botswana and Eswatini, ex-Swaziland, Eswatini. But after Mike's presentation, I think we also have a lot to learn from you after all, from your floods and how you're dealing with floods. So what I will speak about today are how the path to global food security is so closely intertwined and linked with that of water security. And in fact, sustaining water resources and growing food are really two sides of the same coin. I will also very quickly present to you our updated water strategy. The World Bank just launched last month at an event in Washington in which some of you participated. And it really is to highlight how countries can manage their water resources in a much more holistic manner. And I think that's the approach we want to be advocating moving ahead. And also, of course, we have to talk about policies and how we can look synergistically at water security and food security agendas. And finally, end on the message of partnerships. So we know that water is essential for the planet, prosperity, and people. For those of you who work with public-private partnerships, we have a new play on the PPPs. But we also know water is not only essential for sustaining the planet, but it's becoming abundantly clear that we are compromising its ability to do so. Water is a vital factor of production, economic growth is a thirsty business, and diminishing water supplies translate into slower growth. But of course, water touches every aspect of development and is fundamental to life itself. It is essential for food production, for growing populations, and water and sanitation are critical for ensuring good health, reducing child mortality, tackling communicable diseases, and increasing life expectancy. But water is in crisis across the planet. We say there's too much, too little, and too polluted. We are all experiencing a water crisis, be it local or global. So Mike talked about the floods, and you mentioned that 9 out of 10 natural disasters are water-related. And projections indicate that heavy precipitation events, such as the second cyclone that just hit Mozambique in the last few weeks, will increase over many areas. We know that headlines capture the impacts of floods on cities and villages, and what we just saw here, pictures of cyclones, show the tragedy of families standing on roofs waiting to be rescued, or the pictures that Mike just showed. But the longer damages to crops and floods water recedes do not grab the same headlines. We also know how much water is required for food production across the entire supply chain. Growing food is inherently water intensive. However, about a quarter of our world's food production is happening in highly water-stressed areas, impacting some of the most notable examples of water stress. Whether it be surface water in California, the southern, I've been told to say southern, Ogallala Aquifer, in the Great Plains, groundwater in India and Pakistan, the northern China plains, across the Middle East, and now even parts of sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, water pollution is increasing and has severe impacts on human capital and the planet. Growing evidence of the extent of the pollution is alarming, much of it from agricultural runoff and untreated sewage, but also there are growing international concerns about ocean plastics and nanoplastics appearing in our rivers and lakes. Fertilizers from agricultural runoff greatly threaten water quality, both for crops, which are nutrient sensitive, but also for ecosystems and the health of 2.7 billion people who live in highest risk water quality basins. And we've heard that the pressures and extremes are increasing. The water crisis is getting worse because of climate change, population growth and urbanization, consumption patterns, and pollution. Climate change is exacerbating pre-existing water stresses and is already having a measurable effect on the water cycle, altering the amount, the distribution, the timing, and quality of available water. At the same time, by 2050, the urban population will nearly double, leading to greater demand through drinking, sanitation, and food, while also creating more pollution. And by 2030, food demand is projected to grow by 70%, as changing diets become even more water thirsty. The resulting growth in agriculture will entail additional demand for water and exacerbate groundwater and surface water quality problems. So it's quite a doomsday. But on top of that, we look at a much less often issue that contributes a lot to the water global crisis, and that is that more than 30% of food produced is wasted. That is 1.3 billion tons of food, mostly fruits and vegetable crops, that are grown and brought to the market. This amounts to $680 billion per year of wasted food. Consumers in industrialized countries waste as much food per year as the entire food production of sub-Saharan Africa. Wasted food is wasted water. And of course, the topic of this conference is really looking at nutrition, food, the human face of hunger and malnutrition. So while parts of the world waste so much food, hunger and malnutrition are holding many of us back. The irony is that while there are pockets of extreme and chronic hunger affecting over 124 million people in the world, most of whom are living in conflict-affected zones, and another 700 million people are challenged by hunger and undernourishment, an almost equal number of people are obese, with obesity affecting 1 in 8 adults globally. Obesity and undernourishment exist in the same countries. This means that approximately 3 billion people, or close to half of the world's population, are either not eating enough or eating the wrong type of food, resulting in debilitating illnesses and high costs of public health. Diseases associated with poor diets are the leading cause of premature death worldwide. How many of you know the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, I wish everyone would raise their hands in the room. So these are the goals that all countries in the world ascribe to achieving by 2030. And we know there's a special goal for water, goal number 6. It talks about delivering water and sanitation, universal access to water and sanitation. That's 800 million people in the world who don't have basic water, about 2 billion without basic sanitation, preserving our ecosystems and our water resources in a very participatory manner, also looking at the inclusion of gender and women. And there are goals for food production as well, and for agriculture and for poverty. But we know that water flows through nearly every single one of our 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And these targets are only going to be achievable with water supplies available for food, for drinking water and sanitation, for health, water to produce energy and power for industries and new jobs, and water to nourish the planet's ecosystems. We only have 11 years left to 2030. So we know that to deliver on the SDGs, the world needs to change how it understands, values, measures, and manages water. So how many of you know this, we call it the wedding cake? This is the Planetary Boundaries, and I actually saw one of the presentations yesterday. Someone did present the Planetary Boundary, and this is a work of our colleague Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Center, where his team coined the concept of planetary boundaries as a concept involving Earth system processes which need to operate within contained environmental boundaries for our planet to survive. So his team plotted the SDGs within this framework, and where he shows that if we want to achieve our societal goals and economic aspirations, we can only do that if we take care of our biosphere. So when you see on the bottom layer of our biosphere, there are 4 sustainable development goals which are related to water, to land, to oceans, and climate. These form our biosphere. And their preservation is non-negotiable if we want to deliver the higher level goals, the societal goals, such as reducing hunger and poverty, providing health, gender equality, education, cities, and energy. And only when these societal goals and the planetary boundaries are achieved are we able to fulfill our goals of industrial development, jobs, and partnerships at the very top. So moving into water in the World Bank Group, my colleague Stephen Schomburger was here last year, with 2 years ago, with a group of 11 people. How many of you were here? Okay, so he spoke a little, not very many, so that's good to know. There's always new people in the audience, and this is also, like I said, my first time here. He presented what we did at the World Bank. He gave the World Bank 101. The World Bank is made up of what's mostly known as the World Bank Group. The biggest part of the World Bank is the IBRD and IDA, and we provide concessional loans to developing countries with technical assistance, and we lend through government. And we also have our private sector arms, which are the IFC and MEGA. And they work, and we have some colleagues here from IFC. They're much smaller, and they work directly with the private sector, also providing loans, equity, technical assistance, and guarantees. But we made a commitment as a World Bank Group to work together across the public and private sector. But the other thing we did is 4 years ago we reorganized, and we formed global practices. And for the first time, we took 32 units from across our regional departments and sector units that worked on water, and we created one big global practice. So what we do, this is one slide that says what we do very quickly with our 300 staff and lots of partners. We're the biggest, largest public financier of water globally in developing countries. We have an active portfolio of about 29 billion projects, about 170 projects in over 60 countries. And we take that responsibility very seriously of being one of the biggest financiers of global water. And it's very, very important that we need to constantly offer cutting-edge knowledge and global experience to design customized country-level solutions that respond to client priorities. And that's why we believe it's so important to work with all of you on the knowledge agenda, so that we can provide policy advice based on evidence and analysis based on sound methodologies. So these types of partnerships that we have now, they help us build the knowledge that take what you are learning in academia and apply it to policy and to implementation. And what you're learning from working with farmers and from implementing are so important that they all come together on the advice that we provide to our colleagues in developing countries. So we've recently updated our strategy. We've maintained the vision, which most of us who work in the water space, which is a water secure world for all. And we're doing it through 3 pillars. One, about sustaining water resources. The other one is focused on delivering services. And the last one is on building resilience. Now, delivering services, both water supply and sanitation and water for food, is about 70% of our lending, and that's what our clients want. But the other parts of our strategy are even becoming more and more important. So under sustaining water resources, we moved away. A lot of us have been working on integrated water management, IW, integrated water resource management, IWRM, right? This is what we're moving away from managing to sustaining. We really need to embody the concept of sustaining our water resources in what we're doing. So we know now more and more, which is interesting, that when we're delivering services, water and sanitation services in cities, it's actually the cities themselves who are saying to us, we actually need water to put in the pipes. The farmers are saying we need water for our canals. So we are now looking at ways that we're supporting countries to build the institutions required to sustain the water resources. And it's very, very important that we also look at how we value water across users, time, and space, and looking at issues of water quality and quantity. And we look at water for environment, social, and economic purposes. We also are looking much more at storage, and the slides will come back, I think. And storage, options for storage, which is becoming more important. And it's surface storage, it's groundwater storage, it's built infrastructure, it's natural infrastructure. And finally, very, very important, and it's come up now, we're living it every day, is looking at the need to build resilience to water variability and uncertainty from climate change, but also resilience to shocks, including due to fragility and conflict. So I'm hoping the slides will come back up. Do we need, I don't know who needs to do that. Just keep on going? Okay, but I presented these as 3 pillars. And in fact, we actually, on my next slide, would show that we see this as a circular, the holistic approach to water, that we have to sustain water resources to deliver service and build the resilience at the same time. So we're moving towards managing water within the hydrological cycle and looking at water and understanding it's a finite resource with demand outstripping supplies. So our approach is one of using country water platforms. It's supporting countries to bring together all the users of water, the policymakers, along a watershed, looking at the water needs for health and nutrition, for agriculture, for energy, for poverty, for flood protection, for disaster risk management. Looking at water and poverty, water in the economy, water security. How do we grab the attention of ministers of finance who make the decisions about water? So a lot of this analytical work and working a lot with you in the modeling that you're doing really is how do you make a case for water? How do you let people know the importance of investing in water across and working together to ensure water across all segments? So the next one, I'm on that. So that's the country water platform of bringing together all the stakeholders around a common agenda. And we also recognize that we need to do this on a given watershed. And I was just talking with someone yesterday from the private sector, where a lot of private sector companies, it's interesting, they have really commendable goals of water savings, but they do it at a company level. And so now we're talking a lot more, but if you really want to look at sustaining water resources, you really have to look at the watershed. So how do we bring these ideas of working on multi-stakeholder platforms around a common watershed, but also at the national level on the policy agenda? So on the next slide, I just want to move into 4 areas of the approach that we find are very, very important on the policy side. And of course, institutions matter. And what we've been very, very happy here is that when we talk about institutions in the water for food space is a recognition in the last few years that it's not just big public sector finance irrigation schemes or big private schemes, but looking at farmer-led irrigation, looking at small-scale solutions and finding a policy and regulatory environment that will enable them. And that was our lunchtime speaker yesterday. I think that really presented that. But it's the same thing in water supply and sanitation. We have a lot of urban utilities, but there's also a lot of community-provided systems. So how do we value the diversity of service providers, making sure they have upward and downward accountability in a very clear, sound regulatory framework? As I mentioned, we are also looking very closely at valuing water. And yesterday we had very nice presentations on water markets. But we need to recognize that in most of the countries where we're working, we don't have the legal structure, we don't have the data, we don't have enforcement mechanisms or water rights or land rights to implement these markets. We need to look at other ways of allocating and sharing water across all of the competing needs in a very transparent and equitable manner. And on the regulatory side, we also think it's a very important space if we want to look at water in a holistic manner in a circular economy on wastewater reuse. And what are the environmental treatment standards that we have, either for reuse or just even discharging into the environment? Many of the countries where we work have environmental standards that are so high that they have 90% of their wastewater that's not treated. And when we want to support them to put in place wastewater treatment plants, the environmental standards are so high and we're discharging into polluted rivers. So how do you have a fit-for-purpose treatment, either to discharge rivers and to reuse water? Of course, as the World Bank, we have to talk about financing and pricing and investments. And we recognize that the huge investment needs to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. For water alone, we need tenfold in investment just to achieve SDG 6. The public sector resources will not ever be able to reach this goal. We need to crowd in private finance. We need to fundamentally change the way the sector is financed. So while we value water, services must be paid for and priced. There's only 3 ways to pay for services. It's either user fees or tariffs, taxes, or transfers. Transfers also are eventually paid by taxpayer dollars, either from rich countries to poorer countries or from cities to rural areas. So the power of pricing is very, very important. And if we want to crowd in private investment, we need credit-worthy service providers. We've been working a lot in this space in the urban area, urban utilities, and there's a lot of lessons I think we can learn from there to bring over into the agriculture sector. So economic incentives and prices are very powerful ways to manage scarcity and reflect the true costs of service provision, including meeting water quality standards. So we know that when we do have high levels of cost recovery, we can have sustainable systems and we can bring in additional finance. But there are many, many subsidies in the sector, both in the urban side and the municipal and domestic water side, as well in the agriculture side, that are perverse. And they underprice water, and we provide an economic signal to users, farmers, industries, households, that water is an abundant resource. And it should therefore come at no surprise that there's overuse and inefficiencies in its management. In fact, OECD estimates that every year, 50 countries provide about $500 billion in agriculture producer subsidies through mechanisms such as regulated prices, subsidy payments, and land use restrictions. But these perverse incentives for agriculture also impact water. So the more that we produce food, we also are producing and using water. So it's really important for us to look at the policies in the farm sector, in the agriculture sector, and the water sector together. Even in the urban sector, we just completed a recent study, and we looked at 56% of subsidies of urban water utilities in 20 countries reach the wealthiest quintile, or the wealthiest 20% of the population, and only 6% reach the poor. I mentioned 600 million people do not have access to basic services, water services. So again, how do we look at the subsidies so that they're targeted to where we need them? How do we better spend our subsidies? Inclusion, and I'm glad I think everyone today has talked about the social side and participation, and how do we go beyond participation to really voice an agency? And it's not just participation of women and gender issues, but we're really talking about a broader participation of minorities, of indigenous people, of the poor, of the disabled, of the old, really thinking through how do we actually get everyone involved? And it was interesting yesterday, it's women who always have to carry the water, or children have to carry the water and fetch the water. But in some cases, a lot of the farmers are women as well. But they do not have ownership of the land assets or the water assets, and they're not being consulted. So again, how do we make sure that we really are bringing much more inclusion and transparency into decisions about water? I am delighted to see so many the youth here, the students here, and it was great to see many of your posters yesterday. And please keep up the great work. We need to. The Sdgs were created by a bunch of our old people in the room, but in fact, you are the ones who are going to have to take this forward. And so very, very important is how do we educate and how do we empower the next generation? So that's a very, very big part of the inclusion agenda. And we talked about innovation. And I've learned a lot. It's been great. And again, we're looking at the public policy side. How can we help governments formulate public policies that crowd in innovation and support innovation? So we talked a lot about data and how farmers can now have access to all the data in their cell phones, and how do you democratize that and make it equally available to everyone in the developing countries. But also data, and Mike, you talked about data that you can forecast. How do you help countries really have better hydromet systems so they can forecast floods and droughts, and they can measure water quality? So how do you take satellite data from remote sensing, and how do you ground truth it with local systems? So it's not just putting in place the information systems, but also the institutions who will manage the systems. We talked technology. There's really lots and lots of exciting, interesting things out there and technologies. How do you go to scale? What are the policies needed to bring these to scale? So even for us, where we have big loans to government and they're doing lots of big public sector procurement, how do you change the way public sector procurement is done so it's technology neutral? It's focused on outcomes and outputs and not on inputs. And that's how you can crowd in new technologies. But how do we support the incubators and the entrepreneurs to go to scale? So understand what the policy regulatory barriers are and the financing that allow them to come to scale. So this is the whole space of innovation and information, technology, Internet of Things, innovative service delivery models is such an important space. And I think yesterday the presentation saying how we can leapfrog ahead generations by sharing these technologies and these innovations. And finally, my last point is on partnerships, as I mentioned before. Delighted to be here, delighted to meet new partners. We all need to work together if we really want to find the water-secure world for all. We're open to partnerships. We talk about the importance of science and linking to policy, but I really, really like bringing in the farmers and the implementers and learning from implementation. And how do we close that loop and share our knowledge? So my very last slide just reminds us of our water-secure world for all, about sustaining water resources, building resilience, and delivering services. Thank you.